Hey good folks, I'm Banavam here for CG Tuts and welcome to the third part of the ice cream bar tutorial. And here we are in RealFlow. I have just opened up the program and immediately the project management window popped up. And this is a good opportunity to run over creating a new project. In the location folder, I have inserted the ice cream bar folder and created a new folder for the RealFlow files called RealFlow files. And the project name is called Viscosity Liquids, since this is the subject of this particular lesson. And just hit the Create a New Project button. Navigation inside RealFlow is very similar to Maya, basically the same controls. The UI is actually very close to Maya as well. So if you're a Maya user, you would find it very intuitive and very easy to use. Before we import the ice cream bar and start emitting chocolate all over it, I would like to discuss the ways to achieve a stable viscosity liquid simulation. Viscosity liquid can be chocolate, can be caramel, yogurt to some degrees, machine oil, and honey of course, and so on and so forth. We'll create a floor and create a generic viscosity liquid just to explore the means to get there. And after that, we'll see how we can apply that we have learned to a vertical surface such as the ice cream bar. Inside RealFlow, we'll have the possibility to create primitive polygons. Under this little icon of this yellow square, we'll click on it once and create a plane. It can be a little larger, so let's toggle down the node, and under scale we'll set it to 2 by 2 by 2. I'm jumping from X, Y, and Z by hitting tab. This is our plane. Let's create an emitter. The emitters are under this three dots icon. For now we'll use the circle emitter. Let's take it up. Before we move any further, I would like to mention one thing. When we're working in Maya, we have the ability to set up the working units, which means we are specifying the value for a single grid square, whether each grid square is equal to 1 millimeter, 1 centimeter, or 1 meter. And if we'll jump into Maya, if we'll go to the settings, we have the ability to choose if the working units are centimeters, millimeters, meters, inches, foot, or yards. However, in RealFlow, the working units is already set for us, and each grid square is equal to 1 meter. So right now we are working on a 10 meter by 10 meter sized plane, which is pretty large. So just bear that in mind. Further on when we will import our Maya mesh in here. Basically, right now we are set to go, right? So all we need to do is go to simulate and start simulating the liquid. Pretty simple, right? So as you can see, the liquid is falling down on the plane and we have reached the end of the timeline. So maybe I'll just reset it and bring the emitter a bit down so it won't have such a long way to go. We can see a bit more. And one more thing, let's scale the plane back a bit smaller. Let's say something like 0.5 on 0.5 on 0.5. So it's 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters. Let's hit simulate and see what happens. So the particles hit the plane and the plane is ending somewhere here, and the particles just keep on floating in space. It's not very natural-like. Reset that. We need to add gravity into the scene, and to add gravity we have the demons section, which is this little icon between the meshes and the emitters, and here we have the gravity. So let's try this again. We're simulating, the particles are falling and falling down into the air. Now right now we are simulating relatively small amount of particles, and the machine is keeping on the calculation for each and every particle, even though we don't really need to see all those particles, because right now all we need to view is the particles that's hitting the plane. This is a very unstable simulation and it can crash RealFlow very fast. If I had more particles in the scene, RealFlow would probably crashed by now. So let's reset the scene. First step in making sure that RealFlow isn't crashing is to delete the particles which you no longer need for the scene. The way to do that is to create yet another daemon. We'll go to the daemons section and we'll need the K volume, the kill volume. So right now everything that's within this kill volume square here will be calculated and everything outside of it will be deleted. So obviously first we need to fit it to the scene. We can do it by scaling it as we've seen already in the node section. And also we have these two buttons in the K volume section. We have fit to object and fit to scene, and I'll hit fit to scene. So let's see how this works right now. And as you can see, all the particles that are reaching the edges of the kill volume are being deleted and not being calculated. And now let's start talking about creating a viscosity liquid. So right now the particle properties are set to give us a liquid that's very similar to water. And viscosity liquids won't always have the same parameters. The viscosity liquid I'm aiming to is chocolate, melting chocolate around 30 degrees, 70% cocoa, and all of those parameters have effect on the liquid itself. So after doing some research, I found that the density, right now the density is set to 1000, which is water. The density of the type of chocolate that I'm looking for is around 1300. It can go up to 1350 or even 1400, and I'm gonna stick with 1300. The initial pressure, the internal pressure, is in charge of having the liquid explode as it hits another object, as we've seen with water. And in this case we want a very small amount of that, so we'll set it to 0.2 or something like that. Viscosity, our main issue here. 3 is equal to water. I am after something closer to 400. The surface tension, well, surface tension is a tricky thing. To explain it correctly, you should think of mercury. Whenever two drops of mercury connect, they tend to stick together. And for now we'll leave it at the default 0. Further down the line we have the circle parameters. The speed by default is set to 2. We might have to increase that further down the line. vrandom and hrandom. You might have noticed that actually that's simulated right now. By the way, the key shortcut is A to simulate. You can see the polygons are falling in a grid-like manner. It's not that much of a grid right now since we've increased the viscosity, but it still is very grid-like at the moment. Okay, I can see some issues here. Let's let it simulate for a bit more. Okay, let's stop the simulation, hit A again. The grid that we're seeing here isn't what we're after, so we are going to add some randomization to the vrandom, and that will be 2. And as you could see, once the particles hit the ground, they bounce off the ground. This isn't the behavior we are after. We want to accumulate on the ground, so we'll have to go into our plane under particle fluid interaction. We have some parameters I would like to change. First, the bounce. The default is 0.25 and I don't want any bounce whatsoever, so 0. And the second one is sticky. It has to do with how much the particles would stick to the surface. Not exactly a rule of thumb, but something very close to a rule of thumb. In most cases you would like the viscosity of the emitter and the stickiness of the surface to be the same value, at least for viscosity liquids. Let's reset, Control A. Before we start simulating once more, I would like to apply some small animation to the emitter. Let's mark the circle. We'll animate it on the z-axis. So in 0, we'll set it to 0.5. Right click on 0.5 and hit add key. In 10 frames, we'll set it to minus 0.5 and right click, add key. And in 20, set it to 0.5 once again, right click, add key. Now to see the keyframes, I'll double click on the position and that would pop up the curve editor. It seems that the animation is a bit too rough. So create some adjustments. Instead of 0.5, we'll set it to 0.3. 0.3 and minus 0.3. Okay, one more thing. The keyframes right now are very linear, so we'll switch them to Bezier type by clicking this button here. And we'll mark this last keyframe, go to Keys, Last Node Behavior, and change it from Constant to Loop. And that way we have the animation recurring eternally. Let's just make sure of that. Yes. Okay. And one more thing. We'll create a null object under the primitives section. And we need to set it at the same position as our circle emitter, which is, we'll just copy this value, paste it to the null. By the way, by pressing 1, I can switch to top view, 2 is side view, 3 is the front view, and 4 is perspective view. So just selecting the position where the emitter is approximately the middle, and at this point I just want to parent the emitter to the null. So we'll go back to the circle emitter, and in the node parameters I have a parent option, parent to. By just clicking on it I can choose from the menu, and I'm choosing the null obviously. Create a small animation for it. It will start off at this end, and we'll set a keyframe for the x-axis. So right click on the x-axis and add key. At the end of the animation, we'll move it to the other side, right click, add key. So right now, this is the animation we get, and I think the circle animation might be a bit too much. Let's go back to the curve editor, and let's move this last frame. Instead of 20, we'll move it to 30, and the middle one to 15. That would even it out a bit more. Okay, this is a bit more like it. Cool, let's hit 4 and step back. Very good. Now let's simulate and see how it looks. I've stopped the simulation at this point to show you something. As you can see, I get some particles popping out and floating in space, which is a telltale sign for a very unstable simulation. And of course our liquid shouldn't behave that way. Best way to get rid of that, next to the simulation we have a small arrow. Let's click on it and go to options. Here we have the minimum substeps and maximum substeps. The minimum substeps right now is set to 1, and we'll set it to 100. Let's resimulate and see how it looks. Control A to reset and A to simulate again. So again, I stopped the simulation at this point. I've scaled the plane to 5 by 5 by 5 and fitted the kill volume to the scene. And as you can see, I still have some unstable simulation here. I still have some particles popping out and pretty much ruining the scene, and of course causing an unstable simulation. So two things we need to do to prevent that. The first one is go to the demons section and create a drag force that would drag down any particles that are too fast. Looking at the particles colors, you can see how fast the particles are. White means that they're at their maximum velocity, and blue is their minimum velocity. So as you can see, these particles inside right here are way too fast, and the drag force would help take care of that. Other than that, we'll go back to our options and set the minimum subframes to 300 and the maximum substeps to 500. The drag force by itself would probably take care of all the popping out particles, but this amount of substeps is the only way to get the viscosity liquid fold into itself, as we know from chocolate and caramel and so on. RealFlow would warn us that this amount of substeps is too large and we need to choose a smaller amount of substeps, but we can ignore that. Let's reset the simulation and simulate again. Okay, so I've let it simulate for a while, and as you can see I've got a very smooth simulation, and you can even see the folding created here. It's actually not that easy to see since I'm using a very low resolution. The resolution, by the way, is in charge of how many particles are being emitted. Now that we have explored the ways to achieve a stable simulation and the ways to create a successful viscosity liquid, our next step is to import the mesh and repeat the process. For the chocolate simulation, I'm creating a new folder. Again, I'm in ice cream bar RealFlow files, and this one is the chocolate simulation. Create a new project, and what we need to do first is to import the mesh from Maya. However, before we do that, we need to export the mesh from Maya. So, switching back to Maya, I've marked the mesh that I want to export. Go to File, Export Selections Options, and choose RealFlow SD. You can also choose an OBJ file. I'm not interested in a playback. Choose Export Selection, and usually you would want to export the files to the RealFlow SD. And as you can see here, I've already got some different files from my previous work, and I'll save this one as tutorial ice cream bar. Switching back to RealFlow, we need to go to Import Object, and we'll go to ice cream bar, Maya files, RealFlow SD, and there it is, tutorial ice cream bar, and hit open. It imported the camera and we don't need it, so let's delete it. The RealFlow manual tells you to triangulate the mesh before you import it to RealFlow, but it's obviously, as you can see, not a necessary step since RealFlow does it automatically for you. By the way, by hitting 0 on the numpad, you can switch to shaded view, which is a bit easier on the eye. Group these two by selecting them both, right-clicking on them and choosing group. We'll rename group to mesh, and let's switch to side view for a second. As you can see, the mesh is very big, so we're talking about approximately 15 meter tall ice cream bar, a very large ice cream bar, as you can see. Now by default the settings here are locked, but to unlock them we have this little button here, SD curve, and if I'll click on it I can now unlock it, and I'd rather not move it because when we will import the RealFlow mesh back into Maya we'll have the high differential and I don't want it, so we'll work with it as it is right now and lock it back. Let's start adding the other elements we need in our scene. First we'll create the floor to catch any falling chocolate. 2 by 2 by 2 should be fine. Let's switch to side view and just bring it to the bottom of the stick, and let's create a kill volume, fit to scene. The emitter would start somewhere around here, so I would need the kill volume to be higher than it is at the moment. So let's scale it on the y-axis and bring it to upwards. This should be fine, I think. Let's see, we've got a kill volume, we want a drag force, as we've seen in the previous simulation. And before we bring in our emitter, I would like to actually make some adjustment to the mesh It's a bit too large for my taste. I think it can be smaller by a third. So of course I can do it here, but I would rather do it in Maya. So let's switch over. And here I would like to scale it down a bit. Let's say, okay, so this is about 1/3 of what it was before, I think, 0.7. Let's export it again. File, export, selection options, and we want to export to the same name. Export selection, and I want to replace it, yes. And let's switch back to RealFlow. Let's delete this one. Yes, I want to delete it. And import it once again from my Maya files. RealFlow SD, tut, scream. Okay, this is a more logical size. Approximately 10 meters, which is a lot better. Again, we don't need the camera. And let's group these two. Rename this group to mesh. Kill volume is now higher than we actually need, so we can adjust it. Okay, we'll create an emitter, a circle emitter, and bring it to the top, somewhere around here, I think. And I'll set the initial scale to 1 on the X and Y and 2 on the Z to create an ellipse form, and rotate it a bit on the Y-axis to 20 degrees. Something like this, nothing more than that. Let's switch to top view. Yeah, I'm happy with this. Let's apply the same values that we used before. The density was 1300. The internal pressure was 0, I think. Viscosity we used 400. And we didn't touch the maximum particles. And we set the vrandom to 2. Now let's adjust the parameters for the bar. We've set the stickiness to be the same as the viscosity, which was 400, and the bounce to 0. So same parameters that we had at the previous simulation. Oh, one more thing, we need to set the substeps to 300 for the minimum and 500 for the maximum, and we get a warning, but we are going to ignore it. We take this a bit down so we'll have a shorter time before it hits the ice cream for a faster simulation. So let's these settings and see how it looks, how it works for us. Remember, before we had a horizontal surface, and now we are emitting particles into mostly vertical surface. Before we start the simulation, I forgot one important thing, and that is gravity. So gravity, very important for your simulations. Let's simulate it. By the way, quick tip for you: to speed up your render time, if you'll hit Alt D, that would disable the view, and that would help your machine to calculate it a bit faster, since it won't have to calculate that parameter. So I'll pause the recording and we'll get back to it once it's done. Okay, so I've stopped the simulation at this point, and as you can see, we have a pretty nice viscosity liquid simulation, but at this point it starts to be unstable. We have particles exploding all over the place, and the simulation as a whole is tearing up in different places. Not really what we're after. And that's really the difference between horizontal and vertical surfaces. So let's reset this, and I'll show you the settings that I have made to achieve that the simulation we've seen in the preview. By the way, I made a few slight changes to the circle. I've set the Y rotation to 35, I've scaled the X to 1.5 and the Z to 2.2. That way some of the particles would fall over the edges and slide down the vertical side. I've raised the emitter itself a bit higher, since we are going to be rendering from this point downward. Let's go to the drag force. By default, the drag force is set to 0.1, and to settle down all those wild particles that are exploding all over the place, we'll set it to 0.3, and we'll insert another daemon called kill speed. Now when you're rendering, under statistics you can see the velocity minimum and the velocity maximum, and usually you would want the velocity minimum to be 0 and the velocity maximum to be 10. Anything above 10 or maximum 12 or 13 is too rapid and will cause an unstable simulation. And of course all those wild exploding particles, their velocity is way above there. For that we have the kill speed daemon, which can control the speed of the particles. You can actually speed up the particles or slow them down, or just by default keep them the minimum to 0 and the maximum to 10. So and of course we need to apply the limit and keep, so we'll switch the no to yes, and we have the ability to split particles. What that means that if every particle that reaches the maximum or goes above the maximum speed would split into 2 or more children, but we are not interested in that option, so we'll switch it back to no. So limit and keep yes, 0 for the minimum speed and 10 for the max speed. Okay, now let's go back to this circle, and we need to change some parameters here. After lots of experiments, these are the settings that I've got. I'll set the density to 1500. I'll set the initial pressure to 0.01. The viscosity, surprisingly enough, I'll set it to 150. We'll set the V and H random to 1 both. Now let's go into the bar mesh, and we'll set the particle friction, which has to do with the friction of the particles against the bar. The less friction you have, the faster they slide. So we'll set it to 0.32. Before that we have the collision distance and the distance tolerance. Now that has to do with how far away from the bar the collision happens, and the distance tolerance, and we'll set those to 0.02 for the collision distance and the distance tolerance to 0.03. We do want a very small amount of bounce, so we set it to 0.001. We'll set the sticky to 250. So right now the stickiness is 250 and the viscosity is 150. If I'll simulate right now, what would happen is the particles would fall down and start accumulating on the top of the ice cream bar and almost won't slide down at all. To avoid that, I would need to increase the speed that the particles shoot from the emitter. So we'll set the speed to 8. We have one last setting, and that is the resolution. The final resolution that I used was 10, and that would take a very long time to render. So right now I'm gonna set it to 0.5 just for the testing. So once again, let's run a quick simulation and see how it looks. In the statistics you can see the V minimum is running between 6.5 approximately and 7, and the velocity maximum is running between 7.5 and 9.
In the next lesson we'll create a mesh based on the particles, import it into Maya and continue on from there.